So as many of you know, I am a high school student and I take a class called AP Environmental Science, in which we learn about how humans affect the global ecosystem, and we have a heavy focus on how the meat industry causes a rise of CO2 in the atmosphere. And just from being in the class for the entire year, I've learned so much about how the meat industry affects the environment, so much to just a couple of facts have convinced me to want to change my diet to only eating poultry because it has a smaller effect on the environment. But yeah, anyway, I just thought it would be nice to share with everyone what I know about how the meat industry affects CO2 emissions and how that affects the globe as a whole. So to get started, I'm going to start sharing my screen so you guys can see this calculator I have got pulled up. So this is the BBC carbon footprint calculator, and this is all based on your diet. So I'm going to go ahead and click on what food would you like, beef, and then we're going to say 3 to 5 times per week because that's actually not uncommon for the American diet. And then scrolling down, we can see that that is causing 1,611 kilograms to your annual greenhouse gas emissions, which is huge. And then as you can see, that is about the equivalent to driving your average car 4,000 miles. So let's go ahead and see what would be the difference between beef and chicken, which is all I eat. So that just makes it go down to 284 kilograms, and that is the equivalent to driving a car 726 miles, which is a huge difference from that 4,000 that came from beef. And lastly, let's go ahead and do a non-meat alternative. So let's do tofu. And as we can see with tofu, it is a huge significant difference. That would only be 33 kilograms of your annual greenhouse gas emissions, and that's just 85 miles with your average car. So this is major. It's really important to understand how what you eat affects the environment. So now that we know that meat obviously causes this greenhouse gas emission, it's important for us to understand why this is important. So a lot of people say that, you know, carbon dioxide can't be bad for the atmosphere because it's natural. We breathe it out, plants bring it in, and let me stop sharing for a minute. And yeah, that's totally a valid argument, but the thing that you're not taking into account is that we're currently putting out a surplus into the atmosphere, so much so that the plants cannot absorb it. So whenever this happens, we have to take a look at the atmosphere and think of the atmosphere as like a shell around the globe, and that shell protects us from the sun. So the sun causes, it puts out UV rays, which are very bad for us. It causes cancer, and then it puts out the heat, obviously. So CO2, whenever there's too much of it in the atmosphere, it causes the atmosphere to break down, develop these little holes in it. So that way, whenever that happens, the UV rays can infect us, cause cancer, and then the heat gets trapped inside the atmosphere and it causes the polar ice caps to melt and the rising sea levels. So now we can take a look at some examples of what this is doing to our globe. So let me start sharing my screen again. So let's go ahead and take it back to this PowerPoint. And I'm going to start off with showing you this is an image from NASA satellites. So you can see here that the red line is what the polar ice caps used to be in 1981, and then the white is what they are from now to about 2010. And you can see that there's a huge, huge difference between what it used to be and what it is now. So what does that mean for us as a society? So this is an example of the way that's affecting us. This is the Marshall Islands. They're a small island community in the Pacific Ocean. They're very small and they're very connected to the ocean, so their houses are usually built like on the coast. Well, these sea levels rising are causing their islands to be completely flooded. As you can see, this is not rare for people that live in the coastal islands. in the Marshall Islands, and yeah, their communities are flooding right now, and there's really nothing that they can do about it. So a lot of the youth are taken to activism to try to prevent their islands from essentially disappearing. And this is all because of that rise of sea level. So now let's take a look at something a little closer to home. This is an Alaskan community, and as you can see around the edge right here, they have to put rocks out, and then these big like trash bags filled with rocks around the coast so that the ocean doesn't come in and flood their islands, because a lot of these polar communities, they build their houses on top of what we call the tundra. And the tundra is basically ice and mud that's been frozen solid, and it's been that way for thousands of years. But now that the temperature is rising, all of that ice is melting, and it's causing the islands to just turn into mush, essentially. And you can see that these people build their houses up, and that's because their houses are beginning to sink into the dirt. So yeah, now that we see that the surplus of CO2 is significant for everyone from the Pacific Island communities to the Alaskan villages, let's take a look at how, let me stop sharing my screen. Let's take a look at how meat impacts the CO2 emissions. So meat-based pastures are responsible for 9% of the human-caused CO2 currently. And beef is the biggest, has the biggest impact on this. There's a lot more resources required for maintaining beef and beef consumption, and that includes 28 times more land, 6 times more fertilizer, and 11 times more water than that of pork and chicken, according to PNAS.org. And as a result, beef releases 4 times more greenhouse gases than pork, and 5 times more gases than poultry. Cattle also produces a lot more methane, which is actually also a very harmful greenhouse gas and causes that breakdown of the atmosphere. So the biggest thing we need to look out for is the cattle, but really all meat affects the environment negatively. So now that we know that meat releases surplus of CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which causes a negative effect on everywhere from the Pacific tropical islands to the polar areas of Alaska, it's important for us to understand how this all goes together. And I believe that keeping the consumers informed about the way meat impacts the environment will help us lower the amount of CO2 and other carbon dioxide or other greenhouse cause gases in the atmosphere as a whole. Just cutting out beef helps the annual greenhouse gases reduce by 1,611 kilograms, which is a huge, huge improvement. So thank you for listening.